Hello, hello. Yeah, you got me on my phone, not my computer, so I'll turn
Oh,
that off.
okay. All
I've never
right.
done Facebook Live either, so.
Well, it's all new to us too, so we'll work out the technology issue. We're used to working in the bush, you and I, so we're used to being out there. There's not as much of a technology issue when we're out there. So anyway, thank you very much for taking the time. I know you're packing today and getting ready to leave for Gabon tomorrow. I wish I was going with you and to do some filming. I'm missing being out and with apes all over the planet. So anyway, for everyone who has joined us here on Facebook Live, this is Talking Apes on our Apes Like Us channel. It's our monthly conversation with experts like Dr. Martha Robbins, and I want to welcome her to the show and thank her for taking the time to be with us. Martha, I'm going to let you do the introduction to yourself, so you can do it better than anyone else, I would assume. So go ahead and tell us all who you are and what you're with, and who you're with, and what you're doing.
Okay, thank you. I caught your earlier background on me, and thank you. That was very very generous of you. So I'm Martha Robbins. I work at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. And I've been studying gorillas for a little over 30 years now. I started out at the Karasaki Research Center, where which Dian Fossey set up. I started there in the early 90s. And then I have two long-term field sites now. One is in Bwindi Impenetrable National Park in Uganda. That's been running since 1998. And then another one with Western gorillas in Gabon that has been going since 2005. So yeah, happy World Gorilla Day to everybody. Every day is a bit of a gorilla day for me, but
I bet it is. It has been for a very long time. I hope I didn't overstep, but thinking about the fact that you have been studying gorillas as long as you have, I just don't know anyone in the world who has spent maybe as much time with wild gorillas as you have, and especially all we'll get into.
Many of my field assistants. Many of my field assistants.
Well,
okay.
let's start kind of from the beginning. I was going back to, I was looking at once, just going through some of the stuff in your book, which it's Among African Apes. If any of you are interested, it's by Martha Robbins and Christophe Bosch. And right in the very beginning, you sort of say the who, what, when, where, why of gorillas. But give us the who, what, when, where, why of Martha Robbins. How did you, why gorillas? Why did you get started with gorillas?
I kind of fell into gorillas per se. When I was in college, when I was at university, I took an animal behavior class, and I was fascinated by animals that lived in social groups. The idea of animals, you have individual animals, but they live together as a group, they interact, they cooperate, they have conflicts. And that really just struck me somehow. And primates are the obvious choice for that. And then volunteer at Karasaki as a research assistant and got incredibly lucky, got chosen to go. And then, yeah, here we are. 30 years later, I'm going back to Africa tomorrow.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, it's, I think, so many people hold mountain gorillas. I mean, those are, in many ways, it's an interesting that mountain gorillas are the ones that most people think about when they think about gorillas, but yet the most viewed gorillas in the world are actually Western lowland gorillas, which are the ones that are in zoos around the planet. So millions of people have seen Western lowlands, but in captivity, and yet most people think of mountain gorillas. So, and Karasoke, of course, with Dian Fossey being the site that most people think of, and yet to get there, like you as you said, you kind of lucked into. I doubt it was luck. I'm sure you were an amazing student, and they looked at the opportunity to have you as a great one. But the chance to get to go there, I mean, that's got to be everybody's dream, is to get to go sit, and especially in those days. I know because I first started up there in the early 90s, and you know, the researchers could sit for hours with the gorillas, not like now.
Yes, yeah, it was, and even now sitting with gorillas is very special. One very strong memory I have from when I started was I had been at Karasoke for a month, and I went into Dian Fossey's old house, and there were these old poster boards of photographs of the gorillas, and it was the same gorillas that I was going and watching every day, but they were 10 years younger. So for example, there was Ziz, a photo of Ziz when he was 6 years old, and he was the dominant silverback of a group of 30 at the time. And that really, I think that really hit me in terms of just how long-lived they are, and again, just how social they are. And so, yeah, maybe it sounds a bit funny that looking at some old photos had such an impact. But I think that brings home something that kind of keeps me going even now. For example, in Bwindi, the year after I started, there was an infant named Muchiza who was born. And he's now the dominant silverback of a group. He has 5 lady friends. He has 4 infants of his own. And just to think that I've been privileged enough to watch him grow up from being an infant. And with males, you never know if they're going to make it to be dominant or not. And yeah, so, and I have to say, there is a bit I go out and see him, and I'm like, there's part of me that still says, you're just a kid. But
You do have an interesting family, don't you? I mean, when you think about, you know, over these 30 years to have all these relationships and connections. To kind of get this started, maybe talk about the difference, because Bwindi looks and feels very different than being up at Karasoke and the Virungas. So maybe compare and contrast not only those places, but is there a difference in the gorillas that are there and how they behave because of that landscape?
yeah, so there are only 2 populations of mountain gorillas. The Virunga volcanoes, which is where Karasoke is and where Fossey worked, and then Bwindi Impenetrable National Park in Uganda. And they're very close. They're only about 30 kilometers away from each other, so whatever, call it 20 miles. But there's a very big difference in altitude. So the Virungas are known for being very high altitude. For example, Karasoke's at about 10,000 feet in elevation. And Bwindi, the highest part of Bwindi, is only 7,500 feet. So you have, with that big altitudinal difference, you have big differences in habitat. I mean, just think about climbing mountains anywhere, and you go through different vegetation zones as you go higher. So what this means is the plants are different. So what they eat is different, and how they use the habitat's a little bit different. A lot of their behavior is quite similar. Again, the type of social groups that they live in. But one of the most fascinating differences, and this took years to figure out, is that the time interval between births for females in the Virungas is 4 years. So a female will have 1 baby, she nurses it, boom, and then her next kid comes along 4 years later. Well, in Bwindi, that interval is 5 years. So even between these 2 populations that are very close, there's this big difference in how frequently they have babies. And that has big implications for the ability of each population to grow. You know, you have babies more frequently, and it means you're going to get higher population growth.
And do we know
so that,
do we know a reason for that? Why there's
no,
that year difference? Okay.
we're not sure. I think it probably has something to do with the food they're eating and the availability. So kind of like energetics. And so just the Windy gorillas have to work a little bit harder to get a certain number of calories per day, whereas the Virunga gorillas, they travel very little. They may only move about half a kilometer or 3/4 of a kilometer a day. The Windy gorillas move a little bit further. Another huge difference is the Windy gorillas eat fruit. There's, again, in the high altitude forests of the Virungas, there's not much fruit there that the gorillas would eat. And the Windy gorillas spend about 15% of their time, feeding time, eating fruit. And they love it. You know, it's full of sugar.
Right.
So they do travel further to get this fruit as well. So again, these differences in interbirth interval and so forth, it probably is related to diet somehow.
And speaking of that difference in diet, let's jump over to the other group of gorillas, because that was going to be one of the questions that I had to you, like the difference between mountain gorillas and Western lowlands. And we're going to probably through the conversation, so we'll jump back and forth if you don't mind between the two gorilla types. But I just thought it was important to kind of introduce people to Western lowlands in the wild, because not that many people have seen them. So let's maybe start with that. In terms of your work on Western lowlands, how would you compare and contrast mountains and Western lowlands?
Yeah, a rose is a rose is a rose, but a gorilla is not a gorilla. It's not a gorilla. They are a different species, and so they are still gorillas, but they're different in many ways. I mean, physically, if you look, the biggest, most obvious thing is that Western lowland gorillas, their hair is much shorter. They tend to have more red on the head. They just look a bit leaner because the mountain gorillas, they live in this cold environment, so they're wearing big furry gorilla suits. But in addition to that, just living the habit, one, it's flat, which makes walking around for us a bit easier. And there is, it being a tropical forest, there's even more fruit. So the Western lowland gorillas, their diet's about 30% fruit. So again, just in terms of diet, again, the Virunga gorillas, they have almost no fruit. Windy, it's about 15%, and then Western gorillas, it's up to about 30 or so. So that's kind of one of the most obvious differences ecologically.
Does that affect them in terms of their group structure, in terms of just their I mean, obviously their motivation to move is there to cover a bigger range to get to fruit and other foods, but does that movement then impact the group structure? Because I know, like with the mountain gorillas, as you alluded to a minute ago, in the Virungas, I mean, they don't move around very much. You know, it's basically sit in a salad bowl and eat all day long.
Yeah, exactly. They sit around and eat broccoli and spinach all day long. So also with the lowland gorillas, there's a lot more fruit, but there's actually less of that salad bowl stuff. The understory of the forest is very open. And so what this means is the Western gorillas, they do move a lot further every day. So 2 kilometers, even 4 kilometers, they move for the energetics, where they mature later than mountain gorillas do. So in all likelihood, they just have a slower time to development because of these, what we would call ecological constraints. Yeah, okay, sorry. And your question was about the group structure. So right. The classic gorilla group is a one male group. So one silverback and some adult females and the kids. And so when I was getting ready to go study gorillas for the first time, you know, this is what all the books say. And then I got to Karasoke, and there were all these groups with more than one silverback in them. I was like, they didn't read the books. Something's not right. And it turns out that mountain gorillas, both in the Virungas and then also in Bwindi, about 40 to 50% of the groups have more than one silverback in them. And so this is one of the biggest differences in the group structure. Whereas in Western gorillas, they are almost exclusively one male groups. And in terms of why this is, we think it may be, again, the habitat for mountain gorillas may allow for groups to get a bit bigger. So some males just stick around at home. And then they either wait for the dominant male to die or they usurp him. So it's kind of a different way to become a dominant male in mountain gorillas. Again, some of them do leave the group where they're born and then form their own groups. But a lot of them stay where they are and then take over or become dominant that way.
Yeah, I remember when I first started working up at Karasoke, Ziz, as you mentioned earlier, was the big boy on the block, and I mean, he was huge too. But there was right coming along was Pablo, and who was we jokingly would call a silver dollar back. It was just that little patch of silver was coming around, and it was interesting. The temperament too is having two big males in a group like that. Ziz seemed so mellow, and Pablo was always acting up. It was like that testosterone had to find some outlet, and unfortunately, it often found an outlet by hitting me with a small bush or something, or whacking the cameras or something. But yeah, it was very interesting to see that dynamic. And when I first started working on lowlands in Gabon and other places, that was one of the first things that I recognized, is just that structure of the group. In addition to their mobility, they seem so much more active and physically, and even and I wanted to ask you about that, because the juveniles are that much more active at a much earlier age, it seemed. Where mountain gorillas, for example, the babies just seem that they sit around like the adults do a lot more. They play, of course, but they play within a very small range, where it seemed like the young Western lowlands that I've seen, they just seem far more active, climbing and just, acting out with in terms of being just much more physical. It's like they're in the jungle gym all the time.
Yeah. I mean, we're collecting data, so we'll be able to really quantify and compare play behavior. And the kids on both species, they can be extremely boisterous. My rather non-scientific theory is that with Western gorillas, the forest floor is open. Whereas with mountain gorillas, they're very rarely actually touching the ground. There's so much vegetation, and they're often on that. And I think when you're a tiny little 1 or 2 year old gorilla, and you're constantly trying to walk on vegetation, I think it's much harder. Whereas if you're on a flat surface, I think just simply the forest structure enables the Western gorillas to be a bit more mobile, even when they're very little. And again, we'll be able to test this in a little bit. But Western gorillas, they spend a lot more time in the trees. Again, most of that's because they're up there eating fruit. They eat leaves from some of the trees. And so in a way, it makes sense that they kind of need to practice this a bit more, even starting out when they're very little.
Yeah, that was one thing that I have noticed in working in, Western Congo and that direction on Western lowland gorillas, that they just, the amount that they climb, and amazing climbers too. And I mean, I've seen gorillas just literally go straight up. It looked like a telephone pole. They just, boom, they go straight up that thing, where as the mountain gorillas, as they seem to get bigger, far less, especially big silverbacks and things, far less climbing about, at any kind of altitude up in the tree. So
the Bwindi gorillas climb. Again, I think it almost follows how frugivorous they are. They're definitely more, it's called arboreal, being in the trees. They definitely they spend a lot more time higher up. than the ones in the Virungas. And yeah, I mean, these huge 300-pound silverbacks can just get
Mhm.
60 feet up a tree in a matter of minutes. I mean, their arms are much stronger than ours, so they're well designed for it. But yeah, they if they want to, they can climb. I just think the mountain gorillas that live in the Virungas, they don't really have reason to climb, so they sit around
Yeah.
in their salad bowl.
No, that makes total sense. Um, I just wanted, I know I'm watching, there's several people seem to have be jumping on here. So I just want to reintroduce you, Dr. Martha Robbins, who is joining us today. This is World Gorilla Day, in case you didn't know. And this is Talking Apes on Apes Like Us. And we're really excited to have Martha with us because she's about to jump on a plane tomorrow morning and head for Gabon and go back to doing research. So on a trip like you're about to do, how long will you be down there and what kinds of things will you be doing?
So I'll be gone for about a month. And the first thing I do when I arrive is I will get tested for COVID. I got
Okay.
tested yesterday, and I'll get a test again when I get there. And then on Monday and Tuesday, I have meetings with government officials. We work we have a very strong collaboration with the Gabonese Park Service. So in terms of just having some meetings there, then I will quarantine for a bit because of COVID.
Hmm.
We're very, very concerned about the potential transmission of COVID from us to the gorillas. Fortunately, the incidence of COVID is very low in Gabon right now. And then I will finally be able to get in the forest and see the gorillas. A lot of what I'll be doing is checking up on my staff. I have an established data collection protocol there, and in terms of answering questions, seeing how things are going, giving feedback, telling people thank you for walking through swamps on a regular basis to watch these gorillas. And then in Gabon, we have one group of gorillas that's habituated. We had a new baby born last month, so I'm really looking forward to seeing the new one.
That will be exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's always fun. And then we're habituating a second group. We started habituating this group let's say about a year and a half ago. So just in terms of going out and again, assessing where we are with the habituation process there. Because just in terms of the sustainability of the project and making sure that we have more than one group. And then otherwise, I'm just going to enjoy being out in the forest and just hanging out with the gorillas.
I bet. Yeah, how and Gabon is really nice this time of year too. So it's kind of when I was there in August and early September, and I think it would surprise people. You're right on the equator, or very close to the equator, and yet it was far more pleasant than it was here in North America. So it's kind of interesting. I want to talk about the environment just a little bit that you're going to, and then I'd love to get back to a minute about COVID. First of all, how big is your team that you have in Luongo?
At any time, we have about 15 people there at any time. With the habituated group, we send a team out in the morning, and then we have another team go out in the afternoon, just kind of stagger it, because we leave camp about 7 in the morning, and then they stay out in the forest till about 5. Sometimes we do all day, but it's a lot to do day after day after day. And then again, we're habituating the second group. And then we have some other activities, like once a month we go and look at certain trees to see whether they're fruiting or not. And then we have some camera traps out where we can collect videos, remotely censored camera traps, and get a sense of what other gorilla groups are in the area. So yeah, it's about 15 people in general.
Just in description wise, maybe a little better description of what the habitat there is like, because it is very different from what most people, I think, see when they see gorillas, because they see mountain gorillas. So it's not even though you mentioned earlier it was flat, it's not an easy landscape to move through.
Yeah, this may sound a little bit funny, but I think for people to relate a bit, to say that it's kind of like an open forest in North America, um, may not be too far, but then put in 90% humidity and a lot of bugs, a lot of insects, and higher trees, taller trees for sure. But the understory, so when you're walking, it's much more open. And Luongo is an extremely open lowland forest. And then the other very special thing about Luongo is we have a lot of swamps. Rarely does a day go by that we're not walking through a swamp. Um, and in the beginning, when the project started and the gorillas would cross a swamp, I just thought, okay, they're crossing the swamp. And then reality set in that the swamps, they like the swamps. They feed in the swamps. And so I like the swamps now too, even when I get worms in my feet in the swamps.
Yeah, swamps in the tropics are a little different than swamps at other places. Yeah,
Oh, yeah, because let's just say lots of animals like elephants and buffalo go in the swamps. And yeah.
and they can move a lot more efficiently than we can in those
Oh gosh,
swamps.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I when I was last in Gabon, I was just north of you a little bit
Okay.
near Fernambas area,
Ah, yeah. Okay.
and we went out tracking. We were hoping to find gorillas, but we did encounter some wild chimps. But probably one of the most difficult parts of it was it had rained a fair bit, and the elephants had gone through, and they made these like meter deep, 3 foot deep holes from their legs. And cleverly, the gorilla tracks and the chimp tracks were all in between the legs, but we weren't that smart. So we kept going into the holes, and then you'd have to pull each other out of there. And it was,
Yeah.
it
I
was,
call those
it was
elephant
work.
potholes.
They were serious elephant potholes. Yeah, and I just realized how much appreciation I have for what you and your team do, because it's not always easy out there. You must be really happy
Oh,
when
thank you.
there's that little space where you can cut through to the beach on the other side of the park. And I don't know, have you seen gorillas out there on the beach?
Yeah, so when the project started, we one of the reasons the project was set up there was because there were stories of gorillas on the beach.
Mm.
But they don't use the beach that much. So the dream of the beach gorillas turned into the reality of the swamp gorillas. Um, but I will say I have seen gorillas while on the beach, and it was one of the strangest kind of just strange experiences I had. It was mixed with the fact that it was at the end of the day. I had just taken a bush bath, shower, whatever. So I literally was like wrapped in a towel.
Oh my God.
and and heard some noise on the in the trees right on the edge of the forest by the beach. And I looked and I wait a minute, that's gorillas. And again, this was in like the first 2 weeks of the project. So these were completely wild gorillas. And at that point I'd kind of switched from, my workday had kind of ended. So it had to be one of the strangest experience I've had seeing gorillas.
Wow.
And yeah, I managed to not drop my towel.
Oh, good. um, that I mean, yeah, it would be a really, huge treat to see them out there, just because it would be such a bizarre landscape location situation. I made one trip out to the beach, and didn't see saw some bush pigs close, and saw tracks of hippos and elephants and things, a
Yeah.
lot of elephant dung and things. So and I've obviously seen footage of hippos surfing and all of that, but to see gorillas on a and for those of you who are tuning in, I mean, this beach is one of the more spectacular beaches I've ever seen on this planet. It is this endless white beach that just goes all the way down the coastline there, and so and virtually no one around. I mean,
Yeah, it's a very special place. And
your towel and the gorillas were probably all that was there. So
Yeah, and then a few of my team. They probably were. They probably were more surprised to see me though,
Mm.
because
In terms of, I mean, all of these long studies that you've done, if you were sitting down and having dinner with somebody who had never seen a gorilla, let's say, or really didn't, they thought they'd seen a gorilla, but they really didn't know anything about them, and they said, "Why in the world have you spent all these years? Like, how? What would you describe to them is so special about gorillas?"
yeah. A few years ago, my father said to me, he's like, don't we know enough about gorillas yet?" Which I think, as a daughter, I rolled my eyes, but at the same time, it's a totally valid question. Um, and again, I think one thing that keeps me going is we do keep learning new things. And I guess you can look at that in two ways. One, again, in terms of time. And gorillas are very long-lived animals. So, for example, we still don't really know what the average lifespan of gorillas are. We have a few, some that we know for sure live to their late 30s or early 40s. But in terms of really understanding their lifespan, that's going to go beyond my career to figure that one out. And also, again, differences between the different populations and species. And then another thing is a lot of research builds on other research. So maybe we understand a little bit about their diet and their social behavior, but we need more time to do this. And one little anecdote that really strikes me is when I started out in Bwindi, the two top ranking females, so Binyendo and Siatu, they just kind of put up with each other. But again, gorillas, they travel around as a group all the time. So they probably were never more than a few hundred yards apart from each other for at least 18 years.
Oh my God. Wow.
So, like, that's how social they are. And I mean, there was more than one dominant silverback that time. And then, interestingly, after 18 years together, they both transferred to another male, to a wild silverback, and they went together. But they never groomed each other. They didn't really hang out. But, for if you said you were friends with somebody else for 18 years, people would say, "Oh, wow, that's a long time." I mean, you don't want to spend a few hundred meters for 18 years with your spouse, So just in terms of how social they are, and what we can learn about sociality from other animals, including gorillas, I think is really fascinating.
Hey, we only have a couple minutes left, and because you probably have some more packing and organizing to do before you jump on a plane. For those of you who just came on board in the last several minutes, we've been talking with Dr. Martha Robbins from the Max Planck for Evolutionary Anthropology Department, and she's about to jump on a plane tomorrow morning to fly back to Gabon and do more research on Western lowland gorillas. So it's been really exciting to have her here on World Gorilla Day to talk to us about her experiences over the last 30 years and what that all means. I did have one more question I wanted to ask you, and I've written it down here somewhere there. If you had to say there was one challenge over that 30 years, what would you say was your greatest challenge? And it may not even be with gorillas, but what was your single greatest challenge, would you say, over the last 30 years in all of this?
I'm never good with extreme questions. I maybe if I can turn that into the question of what and being World Gorilla Day, what is the greatest challenge for the gorillas?
Okay,
and in terms of their conservation and helping people understand that no matter where they live, there are ways that all of us can make a difference to help gorillas and to help all the other animals living in the forest. And a lot of the issues are on a local scale, but national and then international as well. And I do think now with COVID, where, tourism has stopped, which was a big thing, it's giving all us a bit pause about local versus national. But And just with so many things going on in the world right now, we can't forget these endangered species. And, they could be gone very, very quickly. And, knowing that the number of mountain gorillas has doubled in the last 3 decades, but that's only 1,000. If you went to a multiplex cinema on a busy weekend, there would be 1,000 people there. That's like all the mountain gorillas we have. So yeah, that's it. And then for personal, I don't know. I think it's something where the challenges you have to kind of twist them around. I mean, standing in the rain, worms in the feet, customs officials. How do I get, salt tomorrow? I've got solar panels and you name it. I got over 100 pounds of stuff, but that's part of it. And again, where you turn the adversity into adventure, I guess, is part of it. And I do my fair share of complaining, don't get me wrong, but yeah, and just yeah, I mean, getting older, it doesn't get any easier. But it's, I've just considered myself so fortunate to having been able to do what I do. And I do feel, I feel responsibility for trying to be a spokesperson for the gorillas as well. Yeah. And I also feel responsibility that the gorillas that we've habituated, they have let us into their lives. And help, enabled us to learn so much about them. And, it's just fascinating. And even after many, many years, and I'm still out there watching gorillas eat, but there are plenty of new things all the time. Yeah. That was a kind of wambly answer, but
no, that does it. And when you said all the things you've seen, I just, as a a filmmaker and cameraman and stuff, I wish I could download all those images onto 4K, because what you have seen is, I can't even. I mean, I've certainly got to see a lot of gorillas, but I can't even fathom what you've gotten to see over the years. And so I just thank you so much for sharing it with us today. Martha, safe travels back to Gabon. Stay in touch. Let us know any amazing things you see and discover, or worms you find in your feet, or anything else that goes on down there. So anyway, we need, I want to do this again sometime. Hopefully we can catch up with you in the field in Luongo, and we can film something there and maybe figure out a way to even do one of these live from there sometime. That would be brilliant.
I was thinking about that earlier. We could try that for sure. That would be great
cool.
fun.
All right. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us. Have a happy World Gorilla Day. And we'll see you next time on Talking Apes on Apes Like Us. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jerry.